Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Today on the program we celebrate a rich and remarkable Vermont story that began in 1793 and continues to this day. It's the story of the Robinson family of Ferrisburgh. Their home and farm became a National Historic Landmark known as Rokeby. Rokeby is among the best documented Underground Railroad sites in the country. The historic site is now a museum that includes 9 outbuildings, a tangible agricultural past, and a renowned Underground Railroad educational center. And while we highlight the Rokeby Museum, we also want to honor the individual who's been a driving force behind the museum for 28 years, including the past 20 years as the Rokeby Museum Director. I want to welcome Jane Williamson. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a daunting mantle that you
Has
wear.
Has it really been 28 years? I think you did your math wrong.
It goes by fast. For those who don't know, what is the Rokeby Museum?
The Rokeby Museum, we call it museum, but it's actually a historic site. We have 90 acres, and as you said, fully furnished for the federal-style house, a cluster of historic farm buildings, and our new education center.
And why did the Robinson family call their homestead Rokeby?
Oh, this is the most common question we get. There is another Rokeby. It's called Rokeby Park. It's a very important Palladian mansion in England. And Sir Walter Scott wrote what was in the early 1810s a bestseller about that site. And it turns out that in the late 19th century, all over, but many Americans started to call their homes or their homesteads or their whatevers after, because the book was so popular. And we've now learned that there are Rokebys. There's one in Woodstock, New York. There's one in South Carolina. Turns out they're all over.
No kidding.
We're not the only one. Yeah.
And so you're naming your homestead after a palatial...
Oh, and I always say to visitors, you should Google it because it's enormous and beautiful. It's really a spectacular spot. And I think for the Robinsons, it was a little bit of a joke because
I was going to say
it's a Vermont farm.
Right.
You know, it's not a Palladian mansion.
So how many generations of Robinsons lived and worked at the farm?
4.
4, okay.
Yes.
And were they all abolitionists?
No, they couldn't all be abolitionists. It was the second generation. Well, actually, the first 2 generations. Thomas Robinson came into Vermont in the early 1790s when everybody was coming into Vermont.
Right.
Purchased the property. It was his son, Rowland Thomas, and his wife, Rachel Gilpin Robinson. They were dedicated radical abolitionists. And interestingly, their children were not exactly the opposite, but did in no way picked up their parents' attitudes or causes. They had many other things they were interested in. So it was really just mostly that one generation.
And did the Robinsons hide fugitive slaves?
They did. Well, they didn't hide them. I always say they sheltered them.
Big difference.
Yes, huge difference. Our correspondence collection identifies about a dozen, I would say, most of them by name. And it's clear that they were not hiding. Jesse, who's one of the ones we talk a lot about, lived and worked at Rokeby for at least a year. And he worked on the farm, so you can't really hide if you're working on the farm.
And so were the Robinsons' views typical of what was going on in Vermont at that time? You
know, that's a tough question. Vermont had a strong abolitionist movement. In the exhibit we have up this summer, it has a map, or had a map, showing all the anti-slavery societies in Vermont. So you can see there were a lot of places where people had these beliefs and actually took action because of them. But most people were not abolitionists. They were always a small minority, both in Vermont and nationally. The Vermont legislature, interestingly, had an abolitionist bent. So they would pass laws and make statements and do things. But a lot of average Vermonters probably, they were busy running their farms. It was not...
living.
Exactly. Exactly.
So as we've mentioned, there are a number of buildings on the museum grounds. Tell us about the main house.
The house, the original home was not actually built by the Robinsons. It was built by the Dakin families and other early Ferrisburgh settlers. It was built around 1789. It's wonderful. It's very small, and when you're in there, it's kind of cramped and slanted ceilings. In 1814, Thomas Robinson more than doubled the size of his home. He added a very large federal addition. It's a kind of a restrained, Quakery, fairly simple. Vermont has some beautiful fairly elaborate federals. This is not one of them. And it's completely filled with their stuff. We often say that they were pack rats, sorry. So it's very rich. You really get the sense of the family when you're in the house.
I mean, we're looking at some of the items that are there that the family actually used.
Yes. Pretty much everything in our collection shows the signs of wear. We have some things that, if they were in perfect condition, might be very valuable, but there's a little nick here, or a little piece missing there. So you really feel that this was a place where people lived, worked, and you can really sort of feel them when you're in the house.
How did it become a museum with all these items intact?
Well, people didn't throw things away, you know,
Right.
in the old days. And by the time the 20th century rolled around, I think the family, the later generations, began to appreciate their family heritage. Talk about turning the site into a museum started in the 1930s. The last Rowley, as we often call him, died in 1951, and his wife Elizabeth died in 1961. And in her will, it says, there will be no auction. Meaning, all of these things that you see that have gathered here over the generations are going to stay here. We're going to preserve them and open it to the public.
So what are some of the other buildings and structures that people will see at the museum?
Well, unfortunately, our barns are gone. We had the site had numerous barns, but they've all gone. So what we have now are a wonderful cluster of smaller farm buildings. We have a chicken coop, a granary, a smokehouse, an outhouse, and it shows you there was the sheep era, and then the family moved into dairying. So you can sort of see that progression in those buildings.
Which, of course, mirrors Vermont's history.
Exactly. If you want to study Vermont agriculture, come to Rokeby. You'll see the whole thing, from the sheep to apples to dairy.
A lot of school kids go through Rokeby.
Yes.
It's very popular. What are some of the comments that you hear from kids who see these tools and see how things used to be done?
Well, I don't know that I hear that much from them about the tools. We hear more from them about the Underground Railroad. We had a little boy a couple of summers ago. I talked to his mother because he left something behind. He came home. He was so excited talking to her about Jesse, the fugitive slave who had worked there. And she said, I didn't know for 3 days that this was not someone he met when he was there. I thought he was talking about someone at the site. And when I found out, this is someone who had been dead for 100 years. So that really shows you how,
Let's
what
talk,
that site,
let's
what
talk
that
about
meant to
that,
him.
because that's your new Underground Railroad Educational Center.
Yes.
And so what's the experience like there?
Well, first of all, we have restrooms.
Yay!
Yeah. The building fills some very important facilities functions for us. But the second floor is completely devoted. It's 2,500 square foot permanent exhibition on the Underground Railroad. We won a national award for it the year it opened. And our goal with that exhibition was to try to bring fugitive slaves to life for people, so that you would experience them. There's a kind of the slave character, which can be kind of a cutout. We really wanted to humanize these folks, so we focus on two men, Simon and Jesse. It's a wonderful exhibition. And then on the ground floor, we have a second gallery, a smaller gallery, where we're able to put up something different every year. So for Vermonters, there's always something new to come and see.
Talk a little bit about why you wanted to personalize these two characters and how that's more effective than just putting a broad stroke to it.
Well, the Underground Railroad, as you know, is extremely popular. It's one of the themes in American history that a lot of people know about or think they know about. And there's a whole lore about the Underground Railroad, that everybody was hiding, that there was a slave catcher around every corner. Even in Vermont, people have these stories. And people like them, but they are based, I think, on these sort of cutout characters where there's the noble northerner and the pitiful slave and the nasty slave catcher. So we wanted to show something more about who these people actually were. We're able to show people so much about who the Robinsons were. I mean, the materials that we have about them is very rich and deep, so you can really get a sense of them. And we wanted to bring that same kind of understanding to the people that they aided.
And so they learn more personal
They do.
things about these
They
particular
do.
men.
Well, let me just say, for Jesse's case, we know that he was at the site for at least a year because he saved up $150.
Which is a lot of money.
It would take you at least a year, probably more than a year, to earn that much money. Plus, he saved it. He saved it in order to buy his freedom legally. In effect, he had freed himself by getting from North Carolina to Vermont, but technically, under the laws of the United States, he was still a slave. So he tried to negotiate the cost of a freedom paper, and the man he ran away from wanted $300. So there's this little negotiation that goes back and forth, and there's a little drama there. And we wrote, actually it was David Budbell, the Vermont playwright who passed away last year, wrote a little play. So you really get to see, for us it was taking a step beyond history. It isn't just the straight historic documents, though they're all included. We let David imagine the conversations that Jesse would have had with Rowland Robinson about sending the letter, and then the reply comes back and he wants $300, and how did they deal with that? And it really shows you this person in this dilemma. And for him, this is life and death kind of dilemma. This is your own freedom. I think it has a big impact on people who see it.
Mm-hmm. Now, after 28 years with Rokeby, including 20 as the museum's director, you're stepping down. What is probably the most meaningful thing that you'll remember about your tenure?
Well, I think bringing the Underground Railroad story out, for many years, the museum mission or purpose was Rowland Evans Robinson, who is the abolitionist's son, and was the most important Vermont writer of the 19th century, a fact that is completely gone pretty much from Vermont consciousness at this point. And it's hard to build visitation plugging a writer that no one has ever heard of, let alone reads anymore. And this Underground Railroad story was sort of bubbling up. And when we were nominated and designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1997, I think that gave us the confidence. The National Park Service described Rokeby as unrivaled among Underground Railroad sites. So really bringing that story out, fleshing it out, learning the true meaning of it. We've also focused on the Robinson's abolitionist beliefs and actions. That's been really important. And today, just in the past year or so, race has become such a big topic in this country.
Right, as a matter of fact, we saw in some of the video Black Lives Matter sign, which you've had some issues with.
Yes, I mean, it's so present today. And I think a lot of people see now that that's a legacy that is not gone. We want to honor that legacy, but we always tie it directly to what's going on today because it's still there. And that's really been, I mean, it's important. It's important to be part of your contemporary world. I mean, everything that we do at the museum is based on things that happened a long time ago, but they're not gone.
Right. It's still very relevant today.
It sure is.
Now, I know you're open seasonally.
Yes.
So when can people visit?
Well, we've just closed, but we'll open again next May. We're open from about the third week in May. We close the last Sunday in October every year.
Because there's no heat in the house.
Well, there is heat in the house, but we just need a break.
Yeah.
And for people to try to negotiate that site with snow,
right? We
need that. The house needs to have a nap.
And you were saying too that this season you've been extremely busy.
We have been. It's been a wonderful season. My desk staff has been saying to me, "This has been the summer of Vermonters." Anybody who's got Rokeby on their bucket list seems to be coming this year, which is wonderful. We get a lot of tourists during the tourist season, but we really like to see Vermonters.
Well, we want to point out that for more information about the Rokeby Museum, you can check out the website rokeby.org, or you can call 802-877-3406. Once again, you'll be open again in the spring.
We will.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us
today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.